This is February 10th, 2015, and this tape is being recorded in the Florence-Lauderdale Public Library. This is part of a series of conversations we're having about the 60s in the Shoals, and today we're speaking with Tom Heflin. Welcome and thanks for being here to
Thanks,
do this
Tom.
for us.
Appreciate it.
I know you were very young in the 60s, but I'm sure you have memories as a child, and you have some family memories and stories from your father and mother. Tell us something about your family background.
Well, from Tuscumbia. Grew up there. My father was a practicing attorney in Tuscumbia. My mother had retired after their marriage. She was a school teacher, and she retired after that to raise me. She was from Tuscumbia originally. My father was the son of a Methodist minister, so he had a new hometown almost every 4 years. No conference when they moved them. But his final high school years had been spent at Leeton, Alabama, where his father was the pastor at First Methodist Church in Leeton. So his strong connection to this area too, but decided to come back here after he had gone to college and went off to World War II, then on GI Bill to law school, and then came back to Tuscumbia in, I believe, 48.
I remember a dedication over at Wesleyan Hall some years ago where some of his uniforms and things like that from the service were put in display cases, and I learned at that time that he had a very distinguished career in the military.
Yeah, I think, and wish I had more information. He was like many veterans who had seen combat, really did not talk about it a great deal, but yeah, he was, I think, awarded 2 Purple Hearts and a Silver Star. And he was in the Marine Corps in the South Pacific.
So when you came along, they were more or less settled in Tuscumbia?
They were settled in Tuscumbia, and he was practicing law, and mother had, as I said, recently retired from teaching school when I was born.
And eventually he gets into politics. So how did that happen?
His first campaign was 1970. He ran for Chief Justice of the Alabama Supreme Court against prior Governor John Patterson, who had, if you may recall, had been Attorney General and beat George Wallace for governor in 1958. And that was the campaign at that point in 1970. My father had previous to that time been president of the Alabama Bar. They had a citizens conference on Alabama courts, which were a hodgepodge basically of different courts with no uniformity basically across the state, and it was creating some problems with administration of justice, and he had been involved in that when he was president of the Alabama State Bar, and that kind of led to the push to run for Chief Justice and to do some reform in the court system.
Which reform actually is considered by almost everybody to be the most significant change in the justice system in recent times in this state. I've never heard anything but laudatory comments about the work that he did. Do you remember any of that while it was
Oh yes,
going on?
I was knowledgeable of it. I won't say I was actively involved because it was in the legislature, but the process of going through and getting it passed through the legislature. I was in Montgomery on some of those occasions while it was in committee and for House votes, so I have some very clear recall of that. I was in my early 20s. I was in college, when all that was taking place, so yes, very much aware of what happened.
How was your family involved, if it was involved, in local as opposed to state political issues or social questions?
Well, my father never had run for public office locally, but he was an attorney involved within the community, had worked with various groups through the community before running for Chief Justice. So he had a political basis here that a lot of it was pushing toward reform. You had, historically, you had so many people who'd gone off, fought in World War II, come back, lived through the Depression, come back, and the country was growing and the economy was growing. A lot of things for change that they could see needed to be changed from the old systems that were in place.
You think that spirit of reform was central to his political career?
I think so. I think it had, particularly with what it saw within the court system, but involvement of more and more people. It was a interesting time, and reflecting upon where we are here today. Obviously, the civil rights movement was very much into the forefront in the early 60s and pushing through those years. That was change, and it was change that obviously needed to be made, but it was contentious. It was created problems within the community and within the white community, disagreement, and that I don't think there was uniformity, and particularly in North Alabama, I think there was less than what, at least is represented, occurred in other parts of the state.
Well, as you probably know, one of the reasons why we're having these conversations is we're looking for more understanding about why the experience of moving from legal segregation to integration here in the Shoals was a little different from the general Deep South or Alabama as a whole. Do you remember any conversations or things that your parents said, things that you saw as a young person during this period of time about these questions of civil rights, voting rights?
My age was such that I couldn't sit here and represent that we had in-depth discussions, but I do recall that their political or on a national level were to support Kennedy and their closeness with the Kennedy administration and the reforms there. They were very close friends with Edward Malden, who actually, I think, had some involvement with the Kennedy administration on agriculture. I recall their support of Lyndon Johnson and his campaign against Goldwater, and of course Goldwater I think carried Alabama that year, so those issues were discussed, but as to details, I couldn't give you anything particularly. Right. In reflecting, it was an interesting time, I guess, as a child, because at the same points we were still, had been and were still in the, I'm not sure I want to call it a celebration, but the celebration of the centennial of the Civil War.
That's true.
And that follows up upon with the events that were on the news, which I think I recall. Of course, you've seen the images of what occurred in Birmingham, the Edmund Pettus Bridge. I remember that our minister was Furman Stow, who later became bishop of the Episcopal Church in Alabama, was in the National Guard and had gone off in the march from Selma to Montgomery, that he was in the National Guard as a chaplain on that and was away from the church, and I recall that very prominently. So those events were taking place, and it wasn't, I don't recall criticism of it. There was some within the community. I recall, of course, obviously President Kennedy being assassinated, and those all events, and President Kennedy being here. I think I related to you, I recall, but mainly as a lost little boy in a crush at Muscat's Airport, and 8 years old.
Yes. Don't
see much, but I think I described it, everybody's belt buckle. Never saw the president.
Yes, that's funny, but understandable if you were small and in a big crowd of grown-ups who were probably all straining over other people to see. Was your family friends with or connected with any other people, decision makers? I'm thinking of people like Representative Carl Elliott or Bob Jones.
Yes.
Did they have conversations about these issues?
I couldn't tell you whether they had conversations or not. They knew them. They knew John Sparkman. They knew Lister Hill. They knew Bob Jones. They knew my mother's family had gone back many, many years in politics also. Her grandfather was A.H. Carmichael, who was congressman, who was, when he stepped down, John Sparkman took his place, I think, in 1936. Mm-hmm. He had also run for governor, I believe, in the 30s or 1940, I don't recall which.
So how did you escape the curse, this hereditary curse of running for office and going to Washington?
Probably best that I didn't.
In our earlier conversation, I asked you something about your memories from Washington, and you surprised me by telling me that you'd never lived there. Never
lived in Washington. By the time my father was elected and I was in law school, almost 24, 25, almost 25 years old. So they moved there. I never moved there. I stayed in Alabama, either practicing law up here or in Birmingham for a period of time.
Well, one thing that has always been attractive to friends of mine about your father's service and your mother as well is that, in a sense, people here never felt that they did move to Washington.
They never really did. They kept their house the entire time. Every time there was a break, Mother drove back and forth, and Daddy was of course, the nature of politics, you go out and visit within the state, and so he generally would be somewhere else in the state trying to visit every county. He made that commitment that he was trying to visit every county every year of his terms, and I think basically lived up to that. But mother would drive down from Washington generally every break they had for whatever, a week, and then drive back, generally by herself.
Well, shifting now more toward your own memories and away from your family. When you were in school or with other children, what kind of experiences did you have growing up about the race line here and how you negotiate those things as a child?
Of course, we grew up segregated. I'm not really sure as a child you realized it. You didn't go to school with children of color. I knew many, played with them, but we didn't go to school. But it didn't seem that strange at the time because there were in Tuscumbia 4 different elementary schools. So there were many people, white and black, I didn't go to school with that I may have known outside of school, and playing or doing other things, but we all didn't necessarily. Obviously, and I'm speaking of the early 60s as a young child, but as you grow older, you begin to realize it, and of course very aware of segregation. And you didn't hear in my household, didn't hear amongst a lot of friends, but you did hear on the news the debates about what integration was going to do, and in some people's mind how horrible it would be. You didn't know what that really meant as a child, but you heard those debates.
Did you think that your parents were trying to protect you against this distressing series of things was going on in the society around them, or?
No, I think it was just what was occurring. My parents were, to my knowledge, supporters of integration when it would occur. Actually, I think when it did first start occurring, my father was on the school board of the city of Tuscumbia, and when they had in making the decisions to close, I think that was when in this local area, I want to say the separate schools closed, I believe, in '68, almost throughout, and integration did occur. There were some students who had integrated before and come to school. I remember the James families, the Thomases, some others who were entered into our school system a year or two before the schools were closed, and to my knowledge there were no problems. I was either in junior high school when this occurred, and Vicky was in, James was in my class. Leonard, who is recently retired, I think was head of civil rights, vice president of civil rights for Exxon Corporation in Houston. He and I still talk. He's never related to me that they faced any immense problems. Of course, they wasn't gladly welcomed with open arms either. I don't want to try to give that impression.
But rather than wholesale integration at once, there was a kind of intermediate period when a few families, blacks, were integrated into the white schools.
Yeah, allowed to come.
How was that negotiated? Do you have any idea?
I don't know. It just really, as far as, still at this point I'm junior high school age, people came. It occurred. Don't know how the mechanism, but apparently either from court action or that you knew that integration was coming. Obviously, you look historically, Brown versus Board of Education had occurred 14 years before
14
this.
years before. Yeah.
So that tide was going to change. It just when it changed.
And so then some of the schools are closed at some point.
Well, I think in '68, all Trentham High School, Sterling High School, Burroughs-Slater, and then in Leeton Training. I don't know the names of the county black schools in Lauderdale County, but those were all closed, and the population integrated within the school system.
So at that point you were in high school?
I'm ninth grade, so
Ninth grade.
basically when that occurred,
Okay, what sort of memories do you have of that, or your peers' view of what was happening?
Some of the white community were opposed to it, fearful of it. Some of the black community was opposed to it, fearful of it. Change is always going to be some. I can only really speak to Deshler, but there was tension, but there never was any riots or fights that really seemed to break out. I have, within the black community, I remember some of the young men and women basically, after a couple of days, there were some question of tension, and I think they basically made a commitment and talked to those students who came from Trentham and said, we're not going to have wars and fights. And I think there was some of the same that went on amongst the white students. Sports somewhat played a uniting role within it.
People could get together rooting for the same teams.
Same teams. It worked fairly smoothly. I mean, it's not to say there wasn't tension. There wasn't maybe things that did occur that I'm not totally aware of, but generally I would have been pretty aware of what went on. And it.
Did you suddenly have black teachers? I mean,
Yes.
And the schools were
black
together?
teachers and obviously classmates. You're sitting. I'm trying to think back whether, I'm sure the lunchroom's integrated by table some, but there was still segregation. I mean, it didn't change overnight. Attitudes didn't change, but it worked fairly well. And what you hate seeing today is the level of resegregation that's taking place. Maybe not legally, but it seems to be taking place in other communities more than here. You look at what's occurred and hearing tales of how communities now are more segregated than they were during the 70s. But it doesn't seem to take place here. I mean, like I look at Florence, what a success story that community has been. The same thing with Dexter High School, Sheffield, Muscle Shoals, all the schools seem, it doesn't seem to be in this community that white flight away from, or the black community just pulling within themselves. Still a long way to go, but I think a lot of things have changed and are changing. I noticed that with my children.
Do you have any kind of explanation for that? I mean, it seems to me, looking at it as someone who moved here 36 years ago and growing up somewhere else, that what happened in the Shoals is unusual. As you mentioned, the white flight, for example. A lot of urban areas in America that are really African-American ghettos surrounded by all-white suburbs, and that does not seem to have happened the same way.
It didn't. You can speculate on what is the reasoning. Trying to think now who the author is, but maybe Wayne Greenhall. Who talking about, I think his line was that Huntsville didn't have the problems of segregation that took place in the rest of the state, or mainly South, Birmingham and South. And somebody said, well, Huntsville was a suburb of Washington. I went back and looked. My mother, when she began her teaching career, began teaching school in Huntsville in the late 40s and early 1950. And I went back and looked, and the population of Huntsville was 19,000, smaller than Florence, I think Athens, Decatur. It changed dramatically to where it is today. It was a population that I can recall, say as a early teenager. I remember the average age in Huntsville was like 25, which seemed at that point.
I never knew that.
That talking, because there had been such an influx of young engineers, young people involved in the space program, people involved in the military. Even today, finding someone whose family is from Huntsville is a challenge over there, originally.
Well, that brings up another speculation. We understand about the case of Huntsville because there's this enormous federal presence that's dropped there after the Second World War. But one of the possible explanations why the Shoals experience may have been a little different, more like Huntsville and less like other parts of Alabama, is that there would have been a very strong federal presence here through TVA and a very strong presence of national corporations like Ford and Reynolds that might not be willing to play to the tune of somebody like George Wallace as much, since they were national or international corporations. Do you think there's anything to that?
I think there's something to it. I mean, the TVA was a tremendous blessing historically to this community. This congressional district I always understood as one of the poorest in the country until the enactment of the TVA Act and the building. Of course, the dams, Wilson and Wheeler, had preceded TVA, but the TVA Act in '33 brought a tremendous amount of growth and to this area. We're supposed to be the headquarters of TVA. It somehow seems to have migrated to Tennessee. But the presence of that brought people in from other areas, not just from Alabama, not just from the Tennessee Valley. the presence of Reynolds, which was their first major, their first production of aluminum was done here just prior to World War II. Ford coming in. Those were all national corporations that were here. And they made a difference, and I think, in what the community thought and where people, blacks and white, had worked together in this community, I think, is my understanding. In either TVA or Reynolds and Ford, they were not segregated as such as they may have been in other parts of the South in this state. So all that, I think, probably entered in, but there's also a difference in the population and the agricultural mix that existed in the Tennessee Valley as opposed to what occurred in other parts of the state also.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you. Is there anything else that you that comes to mind that you'd like to reflect on?
And it was an interesting period to grow because it was change, and you recall that the 1970 gubernatorial elections and all were going on here and horribly contentious, where you still had Asa Carter running for governor, marching basically with Klan uniforms for his campaign. You had George Wallace running against Albert Brewer, and race still played a part, but you also had, really for the first time, the black community within state politics able to exert influence over an election process. And you had some politicians who were willing to go to the black community and the Alabama Democratic Conference and NAACP and openly ask for their support, not hide it. And that occurred during that period, and that was made a tremendous change from what it had been in this state. And
so there's a little more RESPECT.
Yes, there is.
Very good. Wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.
I enjoyed this.
Yeah.